Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source. I meet new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on and chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get to our guests. And I have coffee, and I'm ready to get started. So today I'm excited for my guest. My guest today is my good friend, Mark Eisenberg. Mark, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hey there. So these days I'm a cloud solution architect with Microsoft. I've been in the cloud business since 2009 when we launched Azure. I got seriously infected with the passion around cloud computing and how it can actually change the world. And being at Microsoft, that means the enterprise world. And so that's a constant journey bringing them along.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have a conversation about, talking with enterprise customers, especially around open source and some of the new cloud native technologies. And I think we're going to get to that in a little bit. But I like to start off our conversations always with, like, what's your tech origin story? So, like, do you remember a point in time where you came across technology or, something technical in that sense, and you kind of realized this is something that you wanted to work with or work on for your professional career?
Well, one could say I popped out of the womb that way.
Sure.
Both of my parents have PhDs in electrical engineering. They were both professors, so I was definitely swimming in that pool from an early age. I think when I was around 8, I got interested in my father's ham radio work that he did. He had been doing it since the 40s. And I started working on that. And it was interesting. That was all analog stuff. And I was never really that good at the analog stuff, the hardware part of it. But honestly, I think the moment that I could identify a sea change was first semester freshman year, sitting in my very first intro to programming class. I opened the book and it was like, I tell people, it's like hearing the tumblers in the safe drop into place. And I never
Sure.
looked back. Yeah, I just started reading ahead and doing, and my project that if they wanted you to add two numbers and display the result, I was like putting prompts up there that, with the string and asking for the
Yeah.
first number and the second, then printing it out. And it just took off from there. Um, and each programming class after that was the same. So that was really where I was infected. I did some time in the digital hardware world, but that moment that I can still picture it, that first night, it was a night class freshman year, and that's when I never looked back.
Yeah, do you think it has to do maybe with like I hear this a lot with people in tech in general, like that immediate gratification that you get when you do something right. Like I tell people that is like a very addictive trait, right? Like
Hmm.
when you run across like, you struggle, you struggle, and then eventually something clicks, like you mentioned, like all the things dropping in the safe, and it's just like this moment of euphoria, right? And like we kind of work in tech, through a lot of struggle to get to that point, that little dopamine, that like little adrenaline hit, right? Do you think that is kind of a
Yep.
cause of it? Like, are you a little bit of a dopamine fiend?
What I've always attributed to is this idea that everyone is good at something.
Sure.
Unfortunately, our education system has decided that we all need to be okay at everything.
Mm,
And they don't really select. In terms of education in the future, I really do think that we need to reform it to help people find what that something is and
yeah.
help nurture that. Okay. Now, I get that that's a really hard challenge topic for another day, perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, but so when I had that moment, when I started reading that code, and because of the way my brain is wired, that was the click. That's what I had. It was what I was meant to do. It's interesting because my father, he came up through radio. Um, he's never really gotten the computer thing. And I'm going to set aside the fact that he's 91, but he's never had the mastery of it like I do. But he's got the math. He can do all that analog stuff
Sure.
really easily, and I could never do it. But this is where I hit the zone. And that was where that dopamine hit, I think, came from,
Yeah.
was just feeling that when you drop into the slot, you just know it.
Yeah, it's You said something that's kind of interesting, like the idea of like education in general kind of being too broad, right? Because it's the idea is like you give people access to all these different avenues of professional life, and they choose for themselves. Like I remember, and I don't know if you had a similar experience when you were growing up. It's like you had a conversation with like a counselor, and they kind of there's like an assessment that you did, and like the outcome of that assessment is like what your potential career would be. Like silly questions like if you didn't have to worry about money, what would you like to do in your spare time, or stuff
Right.
like that, right? Like I don't know how much that's done anymore. Like it's interesting, but like I'd like to kind of get your thoughts is like is what is the how do we get technology in front of people in a non-invasive way soon? Like obviously in some communities it exists, right? But when we're talking about globally, like getting a computer in front of a kid is almost impossible in some parts of the world.
Yeah, but then again, I've wondered for a long time. Actually, it's funny. I can pin dates down sometimes. 1996 during the campaign, Al
Sure.
Gore saying, the goal of our administration is to have a computer in every classroom.
Yeah.
And I remember yelling at the screen, why? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Nobody thinks about that. We need to put that, as you said, put the technology in front of them. And I guess the rest just happens. It's kind of like putting things in the cloud and it's automatically elastic, right?
Sure.
I
Sure.
mean, humans tend to think this way. Um, so in terms of, well, I have a bit of a challenge with kind of the STEM push these days, because I think particularly with women and girls that for decades, and my mother was a victim of this, that if a girl started to show proclivities in STEM, they would literally be told, no, that's not what women do. You need to
Sure.
go off and do this other thing. Um, and I think we definitely needed to stop doing that. However, trying to accelerate women who don't have the proclivities
Sure.
for it, that doesn't set them. In fact, I think you and I have talked about while you were still here, we kept hiring people because they had certain attributes, but not necessarily the skills for them to be successful into the roles that they dropped. And then a lot of them would fail. And what have we accomplished at that point? Putting people into positions that they don't have any natural proclivity for doesn't make any sense because they won't be any good at it.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting conversations in this space. Specifically, like I remember when I like one of like my first like real job, I guess, when I was in college was I worked at Best Buy, and then I started working at the Geek Squad, like the in-store
Mm-hmm.
repair. And I was having a conversation like at this point, like I was, a college kid going to school to study computers, and um, it was quite clear that I could do the job, right? Let's just say that. But I remember having a conversation with a manager at the store, and they were very much just like, I mean, I could teach anybody, like I can give somebody a book and teach them about computers. Like, but what I can't teach somebody is the ability to have a conversation, try to help a customer, make a sale, like these, like some of like the quote unquote people use the phrase
The
soft
people
skills.
skills.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I always thought that was kind of funny because in my head I'm like, well, no, you can't give anybody a book on computers.
Right.
Like, and I think that's kind of where things fall down. Like the expectation is that if you just give people the opportunity, they're just going to learn it. There's a lot of reasons why somebody might not want to get into technology, right? But the alternative is if you just kind of say, okay, well, this segment of people, of folks, we just not going to give them the opportunity because we don't think traditionally that demographic actually wants to work in computers. That's the problem, right? So it's kind of like
We should
system.
stop making assumptions. We make assumptions
Well,
and we
yeah,
should stop doing that, right?
sure,
Almost all of society's ills that have their roots in history, the race issue is a classic one, um, that we would actively hold them back. We actively created a box and we put people in the box. Okay. And so, really, the key is to get rid of the box, make everybody have equal opportunity, and then let them find their way.
yeah,
Because I think most kids will ultimately wind up where they need to be if we're not constantly telling them what they shouldn't do or what they should do.
sure,
Um, when I was starting college, I remember I sat to again, freshman year, sitting next to a kid, um, and he was getting a civil engineering degree. Why? not because he loved civil engineering, but because there were good jobs.
Sure.
Now we know in the computer world, right? In the programming world, we need more programmers. We need more what we need are more good programmers.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
We don't need more people who have managed to, like you said, read a book, cram through a class, but they don't have any of the wiring to think logically.
Yeah.
Remember, I told you that joke, because you and I had the same job at one time. Um, a lot of times I look at, what a customer is showing me and I'm like, why would you do that?
Sure.
Because it's just patently obvious to people like us that you shouldn't be doing that. But then if you've simply gotten a degree because there are good jobs in it, you probably don't have that feel and you
Yeah.
won't see that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think the problem becomes, and you said something that's kind of triggering, so I want to dial into a little bit, right? Like the idea of like good developer, right? Like
Yes.
obviously that good developer, the definition of that is depending on who you ask, right? Like
Hmm.
folks like you or me who have been in this space for a long time, we attempt to keep up to date with the latest technologies and trends, obviously not as good as some or as effective as some or whatever. But I mean, there is some troubling in saying the word good because at the end of the day, it's an assumption or an expectation is like, okay, this the person who's in place that makes the decision has the proper definition of the word good, right? So like if you're hiring an individual, it's like, okay, this can be a good developer. But that person's bar might be substantially lower or higher than what it needs to be, right? So it is an interesting dilemma, I think, that a lot of folks, and there's no real, like, there's no assessment that people can take, obviously, because that's a problem in and of
Right.
itself. Um, or like the interview process for technology is vastly wrong. I think a lot of people will concede to that at this point. But I like to kind of get your thoughts as like, obviously I think that the definition of good is really important, but like like obviously what are some other caveats that you think individuals that are in tech today that are successful in tech today, what are some of the traits that they have and some of the traits that you've seen that make people successful?
Well, so it's interesting. We're banding around the word good. What I really meant was great. Because there
Fair.
is a
Okay.
difference
Fair
between
enough.
right? Between
Yeah.
good developers and great developers. And I can really speak more to the great developers because they do have, I don't want to call it the gift. That's a little too spiritual, but they have they are wired for it. Okay. It is how they
Mm-hmm.
see the world. It's just like musicians. They speak a language, a
Yep.
particular language. I don't speak that language. I appreciate it, but I don't speak it. And I certainly, yeah, I don't speak it and I can sort of understand it. Um, and I see the same thing with math is another one. And I know there's a lot of overlaps, they say, between math and music. And I think in our world, in the software world, there's a language, there's a way of thinking that we have that those who are taught how to be developers are different than those who are developers. I used to have this phrase, there's a difference between people with an engineering degree and engineers.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay. So lots of particularly a few decades ago, you could have a born engineer who never got the degree, never got
Yeah.
the opportunity to go to school, but they were every bit as good as the people with the degrees. We have a lot of people today, they have the paper, but they're not engineers. They don't have the skills. So that's really what I see in common is the great ones, they're born to it. They have the natural, again,
Yeah.
overused word now, proclivities for being developers. And even more critically are architects.
Yeah.
That's another skill.
Yeah, and I think that in the phrase architect is always funny to me because again, like naming things is challenging. Like,
Hmm.
architect at company A versus architect at company B, completely different jobs more than likely. So different skill sets required, different ways to, I guess, measure success. Like, but they have the same title. And like that's why I always think it's funny, like when you have companies that have really generic titles, like, oh, you're a program manager. What does that actually mean? Oh, you're an architect. What does
Right.
that actually mean? But then if you swing too far the other way, you have very bespoke titles, which are almost impossible for you to get any idea of like, okay, there's like six buzzwords in your title. Like, what does that actually mean?
Right.
Right. So I think, you know, there's a lot of, I guess, I don't want to say there's opportunities in figuring out how to get the right people in the right place at the right time to have the most desired outcome, right? How
Yep.
do we how do we set people up for success, right? Like you work with customers all the time, right? How
Hmm.
do we set people up for success and, give them opportunities to really build on that success and be and contribute back to the overall ecosystem?
Um, so I may take this answer in a little different direction.
Of course, you're the guest.
I'm observing in the enterprise specifically is I do meet with highly skilled people
Mm-hmm.
who are completely constrained by the way their organization works.
Sure.
Okay. Um, so I think that's something that we need to look at seriously in the industry is how, again, it's kind of another thing of the pigeonholing thing. It's like, we create a silo called architecture. I agree with you to a degree that's a generic title that's applied to different roles. But I do think, and I do believe in the analogy, and there are probably people listening to this who don't, um, between building architects and the engineers. Um, there is that same parallel to me that there is with in software, because when you go from what the function of the system needs to be and translating that into a technical realm and then putting together the general idea of the functionality that, like the data tier. A lot of times you don't need to say anything more than the data tier. It's just where you're
Yeah.
going to store things. Sure, there are applications that need more detail than that, but let's just say that the architect will know that there needs to be a data tier and it can be a generic data tier. And the same with, particularly now in the cloud computing era, how do you achieve design for reliability? How do you achieve elasticity? How do you do high availability? All these type of things. That is the architect's realm.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there are other people who come along and work out the details.
Yeah,
Um,
but those are all kind of learn on the fly job like skills, right? Like last time I checked, there's no like reliability 101 that's taught in like college curriculums, right? Like I guess
Actually, I think because really we talk about cloud, it's really distributed computing,
sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And those that computer science has been around for a really long time. So I think actually there probably is, can be, should be classes in college to teach those skills. Now, I was told a long time ago that because the big enterprise companies, the IBMs and whatever, invest a lot of money in universities, they get to say what the curriculum is, and the
Sure.
curriculum that they want is doing the old stuff,
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
I
So,
joke all the time like I was a computer science major. I did not graduate with a computer science major. I went the uh, computer systems for business realm. And part of the reason, well, there was another reason that we can talk about at some point in time in the future, but most of it was like I just didn't, I wasn't tuned into some of the classes I was taking. Like it was a lot of it was a lot of math, and I'm not that
mhm.
great at math. It was a lot of uh, I'm going to make you use tools that you would probably not use in your real life, like
Yes.
having code reviews in Notepad, and I'm gonna like let's build an ATM using C. Like there was a lot of like not real world scenarios, and that's what really turned me off into that from that curriculum because my whole thing was like I'm probably not very good at like being a software developer. Like the skill that I
Hmm.
have is solving problems, and I kind of gravitated more towards the business side of technology because it's trying to solve business problems. Um,
Yes.
like and like and that was what was interesting to me. And I mean, maybe I just don't have the gene, like you were saying, that like some people are just born into like, oh, they really light up when they talk about big O notation or systems design or
Yes.
whatever. And I just was never into that. Um,
So I hear you. I
yeah.
suffered the same thing on the because I came up the double E side, um, and and I was an idiot. I started college young, and I was stupid because it's like I don't care about any of this theory. It's not real world. I want to get out there and do things.
Yeah.
And honestly, at one point, because I almost in my junior year, I almost failed out, and I forced myself. My father, actually, the college professor, and I was in his department, by the way. he actually said to me one night, he goes, well, maybe you should take some time off. And I remember thinking to myself, if I leave, I'm not coming back. And I really need this piece of paper as a backstop in case something goes wrong down the road. And I have heard from talking to other people that if you go without the piece of paper, it can be a huge challenge. It can be a blocker.
Yeah. Which is
But
great. That's not a
so,
thing as much anymore. Sorry, I interrupted you, but go ahead.
yeah, no, that's fine. I guess, I don't know. Well, here was where because the one concrete example I had was a friend of mine. He was a mechanical engineer, didn't get the degree. He got offered a great job after his third year. And then what he found is he was trying to get promoted. That was when it hit and blocked
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
When they start checking credentials and you're being compared side by side, one's got a degree, one doesn't, and so he was the one who I know for sure. But anyway, so I was like you. It's like, this isn't practical. I don't care. And then I learned in actually my last design job before I left there and went into the sales side of things. The company I was working for built a chip to do a particular type of communications protocol. And one of the guys who was on my team, it's what we call ABD, all but dissertation. So he knew the theory. And he looked at it, and I think it was Shannon's theory about channel capacity. And he said, this chip can't work. The entire basis for the company failed. Because needless to say, the founders were not delighted to hear this. Basically said, this won't work. And it was because of the theory, the math said it. And I do remember when I took classes from my father, he would always say, trust the equations. But I was stupid. I didn't care about the equations.
Sure.
So here's how I fixed that problem as I went forward. I find people who do get the equations and I keep them near me.
Yeah.
I want to be a part of a team with those. So that kind of goes way back to an earlier question you have about, kind of expanding it and sharing it, that having a team with the different kind of skills. Because one thing I know about a lot of people who are really gifted in theory, they're typically not great political players. And, in these organizations,
Yeah.
like you were talking about soft skills before, these are really important. So it can become very synergistic. They bring the theory to the table that's absolutely necessary. We can bring, kind of the full execution plan of how to leverage those people and make them successful, make us successful, and then the team is ultimately successful.
Yeah, I've always equated it, and this is probably not the most, I guess, politically correct way to say it, but like as somebody whose goal it is to solve problems, I'm going to look at every tool that I have in my toolbox or my toolkit.
Right.
And in some scenarios, people can be those tools. Individuals can be those tools. I know that's not the greatest way to phrase that, but I guess from my standpoint, if I can't solve a particular problem and this person over here can, I'm going to try my hardest to get that person to help me. Whether I got to do a favor at some point in the future, whether I have to incentivize them in some capacity, my whole goal is to solve a problem. Because, if you try to solve all the problems yourself, you'll run into a scale issue, right? And if you can get other people to help along the way, that's great. But sometimes it involves having conversations where, hey, I can't do this. I need your help, or I need you to be able to do this work for me. And sometimes that feels like you're kind of leveraging and using leverage in a negative term relationships with people. And I think one of the healthy things that we can do is just be open and transparent about these sort of things. Look, I can't do this. I need your help, right? Or I can't do this, but I could probably do something you need in the future. Like, let's figure out a way to scratch each other's back. And I think that's how can be really successful. And I mean, we as relating to people like me who can't solve every technical problem on the planet. Like, I've worked with people like that. It's exhausting being around them because you just feel inferior the entire time. But at the same time,
you get over that after a while.
Well, sure. Yeah. But like, you realize at some point in time, like, I have some skills because I wouldn't be in the position that I am without some skills. So we have to get to a point where, what skills do I have that this person can also take advantage of? And I can take advantage of their skills. And then it becomes a great collaboration experiment, right?
Yeah. Now, that was interesting because, I used to feel exactly like that. If I was talking to somebody who was really good at something that I was, even like today, well, except I don't get insecure about it anymore. The data people, I have this joke, right? I'm not a data guy. I don't even play one on TV. And, I'm around these data science people and they really know this stuff. And I had no freaking clue, none at all, you know? And, but now I'm comfortable with it. They have that skill. I know things. This is the real secret to it. I know things that they don't. They know things that I don't. And to your point, together, you know, we get the problem solved in the best way possible. By the way, on that ABD guy, um, shortly before that whole episode, my boss dragged me aside. I was snot. I was like 27, I think, 28, somewhere in that. And I was a little cocky. I was a little too cocky. It's one of the things when you're like you and I are, where we're really good at what we do, particularly at a young age, and then you don't really know where the boundaries are, your limitations. You have to find those. Anyway, this guy drove me nuts. This guy, Alan, just drove me insane. He whined a lot. He complained. I took my desk and I moved it into the warehouse in the middle of the summer, which was not air conditioned, just to get
Sure.
away from him. And my boss, finally, VP of engineering, drags me aside and he goes, look, you got to understand, everybody has something to offer. You just got to look for it.
Yeah.
And when I opened my mind, then I came to realize and listen to him. So that's a really important lesson for people, is everybody has something to offer. Now, a lot of times, you and I have been in sales orgs, right? It can get kind of frustrating that the skills a lot of people have are not skills that we respect at all, or that, we think are really that important. But you were talking soft skills before. Being likable, that's a hugely important skill in this world. Okay. Yeah. And those of us who are I'll use a non-politically correct term as well, who are on the technical spectrum.
Sure.
That's not necessarily our strong suit. And so people like that who can be team leads or whatever, who make the system work for everyone, can be really powerful, but it can be frustrating being around them. You got to look for it.
Oh, sure. I think I've always said that if I run across somebody that doesn't annoy me to some degree, they're probably a serial killer, right? Like, I mean, I've run across people in my professional life, in my personal life, and if there isn't one thing, I like to say this, I'm a bit of a pessimist. I definitely see the negatives in people more than I should, which is a whole different trait that I have that needs to get resolved. But when I run across somebody that initially, like, I can't think of anything I don't like about this person, I immediately start to get uncomfortable. Because then I think, like, okay, so what do they have? Like, what they've spent their entire life trying to hide some trait they have. Because, the whole idea of someone being infallible is really jarring to folks. But I think, like, back to the kind of the conversation about balancing skills, right? Which I think is really, really important, especially when you're talking with people that are new and coming into tech. I tell people, like, you kind of have a couple of different paths when you get started in tech. And, at a point in time in your life or your career, you can kind of jump to other paths, and that's totally cool. But you need to have one singular path that you're always on. Like, you can change careers, but if you look at people who change careers, they always have a couple of traits they carry through because it's a part of their ethos, right? So I tell people, figure out, like, what you enjoy doing. Because what you enjoy doing, though it might change over time, there's a reason why you like doing that thing. And that's the thing that's going to continue with you when you go through career changes or job changes or whatever. Right. So, like, how do we help people figure out what their thing is? Like, is it obviously access is an option, right? I also think just good mentors is a thing. Opportunities to work with other people in the business that might expose you to different thoughts and help you build empathy. Like, what are some of the things that you've thought of?
Well, you mentioned the mentoring.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know how much mentoring I'm doing. I've a lot of people that I'm working with at this point. And I think that actually is the best way to help other people, because and we've all been there, right? I mean, we kind of lock in on our worldview, and it gets really hard to see. You don't have to, like, come at it from the side. You just need to move over here and look at it a slightly different way, and it can make a huge difference. Some people that I'm working with, I'll talk about the difference between the word want and need when they're making a request, right? just a subtle thing, and that's the kind of thing that can take them a long way. In terms of the first part of it is how do we help them discover that? We talked about that with the early education. I'm actually coming to the conclusion that a lot of stuff that's not great for us, and holds us back in those areas is actually before we ever hit kindergarten.
Sure.
I was like, the way we're socialized, what girls and boys are told are appropriate roles for them.
Yeah.
A girl shows interest in trucks or whatever, and then she's kind of discouraged. If a boy wants to, is interested in cooking, for instance. And it's kind of weird. You think about what it takes for somebody to become a great chef with all of the pushback that they must have battled through. Okay. Because they clearly discovered their passion and then had the energy to push through all the way. Okay. And I think the same thing is true in our world as well. I came in my wife's family, all business people. And I was the first engineer they had ever met. And I was, you would have thought that they were, looking at some exotic animal in the zoo, the way they viewed me. They knew what to do with doctors and lawyers and accountants, but this engineer guy, not so much. And you could see if you grow up in that kind of family with people who don't understand what it is you're good at for whatever reason, then they're just going to, and it's all subtle, right? It's kind of almost subconscious.
It is all subtle.
The way it's pushed down. So I think as a society, that's something we can do. As individuals, I think the mentoring is really important, but I can tell you from my mentoring that it's hard to help people unwind years, sometimes decades of this kind of preconditioning and help them get out of that. Also, I think and this goes to kind of the earlier topic of people who go into something because there are a lot of jobs. And I agree with your point, find something that you love to do. But if you wound up going to school and getting a degree in something because there were a lot of jobs, there are stories now about lots of doctors and lawyers, and like they hit middle age and they're like, what am I doing? I don't care about this. It was a good income.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's something, especially in tech too, something that I love to talk about, because it's okay if you just want a paycheck and you have some skills that have allowed you to get a paycheck in tech. That's totally cool. I don't feel that way. Like, tech is kind of something that has taken over my life, and my wife has just had to deal with it. But I think it is okay, like, having a life that doesn't involve tech if you're in tech. I would say probably the majority of people that are in tech don't care about tech outside of work. I think obviously it doesn't seem like that if you're on Twitter or if you're on Twitch or some other social media platform. But there are so many people out there that just do the job, and literally they do the job so they can provide for their family or make a little bit of money to buy a nice car, or whatever their reasonings are, right? And that's okay. I think where the problem becomes is when those people that have skills, eventually, what will I think happen over the course of time, because human nature being what it is, people become complacent. And I think the last thing that you want is to be working with someone that is doing the job, they're good at the job, and then they, at some point, after 10, 15, 30 years in the business, they just get complacent. And that can negatively affect your experience, especially if you're new to tech. Like, I was very fortunate when I got started because I was placed on a team that had two people that were very, very senior, loved technology, were published by O'Reilly, like people that were just like they lived and breathed tech. If I was put in a position where those two people were just, folks that were doing the job, I might not have been as excited about doing the work. And I think that's really, really important when new people are joining. If they're not surrounded by people that are also interested and excited about tech, it could potentially lead to them having a disinterest themselves and leaving tech, or them making decisions in tech for other reasons, like, leaving a job to go to another job for more money, which is okay too. But at the end of the day, does it positively affect the situation? I kind of rambled for a bit, but go ahead.
I don't entirely agree with all of that. As a number one, you introduced a new word, okay. So we have okay, good, and great in software.
Sure.
One of the challenges that I do have with people who actually aren't good, at least good, okay, is in this world today, with as dependent as we are on software, unfortunately, okay doesn't cut it at all. and good is definitely not, is barely doing it. You know, we can't have any good developers. We have to have great developers when people can die. You know, when you're designing airplane control systems and stuff like that, you have to be good. The architects have to be good, and things like that. Um, I hear what you say about being complacent. I'm going to lean back on the chef analogy again. That I honestly believe that people who are like us, it's so deep in us that we would never
Sure.
get like that. We may choose to change how we make the money. I used to tell people when I left full-time development and went into sales, my dad, the engineer, thought I was he called me a traitor, I think, for a lot of years. But I used to tell people, I said, I'm really tired of people who aren't as smart as me, who make more money than me, making promises that I have to work weekends to live up to. Okay, it was very frustrating. So I switched, but I'm a gearhead, always have been. You know, I was a regional sales manager at one point. I was an Azure specialist here at Microsoft. The whole time, I was still the engineer. I was still the developer, the architect. All that stuff is still there. I can still do it today. The thing is, I don't want to do it full time anymore,
Sure.
but I still
Yeah.
have it, and I'm really drawn into it. My wife, we're old enough now, I could be considering retiring soon. She doesn't understand how I'm so drawn to this, what I'm doing right now. I want to do this. It's
Yeah.
not about making the money. I coach again on the mentoring. A lot of people worry about who's a senior, who's a principal, who's making this, who's making that. And I'm telling them point blank, I said, do not think about that. It has nothing to do with your satisfaction, with your happiness. To the point you were making, I think you do need to try to find something you love. I find people who I think are worried about promotions and ladder climbing and money and all that kind of thing. I don't think they have what you're describing. I don't think they really have the passion. I think they're just here for a job. And that really holds them back in terms of doing a really good job.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is very, very accurate. I think the only comment that I have is that we still have this problem of like how we define value or talent, right? Like we've said
Mm-hmm.
good, we've said okay, we've said great, we've said
Mm-hmm.
exceptional, we've used every, I can't think of the word right now, every adjective to
Right.
describe
Yeah.
what we really mean as somebody who can do the job effectively without irritating everybody around them, right?
Have we had the conversation about the definition of obscenity?
Probably, but we might as well now too.
Sometimes you say the definition of pornography. Somebody said I should stay away from that word. It can cause negative reactions in an audience. But no, it was a Supreme Court case. It was an obscenity case in the 50s. And I think it was Potter, I think was the justice, who said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that's where we are on good and great developers. I can't define it,
Yeah.
but I know it when I see it. From when I interview people, I just want to have a conversation. I have no intention of asking them to prove some specific knowledge to me.
Yeah.
You know, I have a conversation with them to see if they, to see how their thoughts work, how they would go about solving a problem, and really holding to this concept of that there is a difference between wrong and not how I would do it. And
Yes.
particularly when you're interviewing people, you've really got to lock in on that idea.
Yeah.
Because you can hear something radically different coming from the interviewee in terms of how you would approach the problem, but you've got to open your mind and say, would that work? Would that be good?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, I think the idea of, and I think we all have bias. Like, I've interviewed tons of people, you've interviewed tons of people, right? Like, we all have this assumption when we go into an interview. Like, we read the resume, maybe we'll look at the person's LinkedIn or some of their other profiles on the internet, and we kind of build a bias almost immediately, right? And then it's
Mm-hmm.
our
Sure.
responsibility to ignore that bias while we're going through the interview process. Some people have a very hard time doing that. Some people are amazing at it. I kind of sit in the middle where I have bias, and then that bias can either be justified or unjustified through the conversation. I think something as well that's really, really interesting to talk about is like interviewing in general. Like you said something that was kind of interesting to me. Like we've made a lot of conversation or had a lot of conversation about, highly skilled individuals, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
born with these sort of skills. But then you said something when you interview people, like problem solving is a skill, but problem solving is a skill that's outside of the body of work of being a technically strong individual, right? So there is kind of this balance, right? Of like, yeah, you can have technical chops, but you have horrible problem solving skills. You can have great problem solving skills, but your
Right.
technical chops aren't as great, right? So like meeting in the middle of those two skills or those two values is really, really important when we're talking about getting, I guess, the ideal candidate.
Yeah, well, for developers, it's a little bit more clear cut because they do need to figure out how to solve the problem, and then they need to be able to troubleshoot it when they miss something.
Sure.
We've all been there, right? Okay, so those two I don't know what the ratio would be. I think they're both such strong skills. To your point, if I had somebody who was a great problem solver, could figure out a solution, um, but couldn't troubleshoot at all, um, I would have a lot of trouble pulling them in. Now, if you're interviewing for an architecture role, that's a completely different thing. And then the troubleshooting is probably not as critical in that realm. So, by the way, I think I used to do the same thing. I would read the resumes and the like. These days, this is just kind of how I do it. I want to know what they're doing currently, and I tend to look at where they went to school. Um, having come from an academic background, I don't let that be overriding. I just kind of like to know where I'm starting with on that. And then I try to leave all the details out to avoid exactly what you're describing, which is a preconceived notion.
Sure.
And then, at that point, sadly, it's like, well, tell me what I need to know about you. And you learn something from that too, right?
Mm-hmm.
How they answer that question.
You should at least. Yeah. Part of the reason why I have these conversations, I used to call them interviews, but they're not really interviews, they're conversations, because I have bias, and the only way that I feel that I can grow as an individual is have conversation with people that aren't like me, and or different than me in some capacity, and help grow my awareness of how other people think. Like that's my whole reason for doing this thing. And I think interviewing people for jobs is that same thing, because the whole goal of bringing on an individual into an organization isn't to get if you're hiring someone because you have a project that you need this particular kind of individual for that project, that is a problem, right? The ideal solution when hiring someone is to bring somebody in that is a cultural fit, is a technical fit, and is going to provide value to everybody else in the organization that they work with, right? And sometimes I think in tech, we're so hyper focused on, oh, I need a React developer, I need a .NET developer, I need a Kubernetes expert, and we don't focus as much on finding people that are going to be good fits outside of the technical capabilities they may have.
Yeah, there's and it's bad now because the HR screeners, so many people don't even get in because they don't have skill X, Y, or Z.
Sure. Yeah.
I grew up in DC. In '84. We moved to Atlanta, and I hadn't learned C yet. I already had a list of programming languages as long as my arm. I knew, probably half a dozen assembly languages at that point. Pascal was big in those days, Fortran basically. And everybody at that point wanted C. And it was kind of like, do you know C? No, but I can learn. I'd obviously proved that I could learn languages, and they didn't want to hear it, right? And I always have held that lesson to heart when I'm talking to somebody who doesn't have the specific skill we may be looking for. I want to know whether they can learn it. By the way, when I got the job, the job I finally did land, I got to choose the programming language for the system. So I learned C.
And you chose C. Yeah, of course you chose C.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
I mean, that's fascinating in and of itself. I think it goes a lot to show like what kind of person you are. I think one thing that I'd love to talk about as well, kind of making a large move away from this conversation to one that I think is interesting that both you and I have done, is having conversations with customers around technology choices, right? Like, on this show, we talk a lot about the technology around open source and how open source can enable people to be successful and blah, blah, blah. Right. But like a lot of, if you are just in tech in general and you're a hobbyist developer, or you work for a company that is, I guess, a bit more on the or closer to the edge as it pertains to building solutions, you might have access
Hmm.
to technologies that are, I guess, newer. But I
Yes.
guess when in the space that you and I have both worked in, not every customer wants to be on the edge for a lot of reasons. They don't want to, they don't have the money, they don't have the people, whatever, right? They don't have the interest, they don't have the need. How do we have conversations with those sort of customers and those sort of developers that are attached to those sort of those customers around, hey, you don't have to build everything from scratch. There are these tools that can help you be successful, that are tried and true, that are founded by large companies or founded by large organizations.
Hmm.
Like, how do you have those conversations? How do you start those conversations?
Um, well, really trying to understand why they have the technical debt problem that they do,
Sure.
which I think you're alluding to it. Um, and again, slight difference here. There are a lot of scenarios, particularly in the enterprise world, where they don't necessarily need the new thing, but they need to get out of the old thing.
Yeah.
You know, you and I both cross paths with, production VB6 apps. We end of life VB6 in 2008. So it doesn't matter whether VB6 is doing the job for them. They need to get beyond it. They
Yep.
need to do something else. So that's one conversation that I can have. A lot of conversations get into, if you're using a hammer and nails because you've always used a hammer and nails and it's
Yes.
doing the trick, right? It's okay, to use your language. Okay. Does it behoove your company and your solution to maybe consider screws and a screwdriver, particularly
Sure.
a power screwdriver, okay, to build a better solution that is on whatever parameter you want to choose? It'll make your business more productive. I've been in call centers where they're running, Windows XP vintage applications. Okay, nobody's going to tell me that that is the pinnacle of productivity in the enterprise. Okay, so I guess the answer to your question is I tend to look very much at what are the business requirements that are driving them forward on the applications they're building, and then make the case for why they should be open to a different approach.
Sure.
And in my current world, in the Azure space, where cloud is actually different than a traditional race floor data center, it's it's not a matter of, well, you can use the same old techniques in Azure and be successful with it. The reality is there are assumptions you're making when you're doing that. Um, and so it's a big, long conversation, really. And it requires a lot of trust. You have to build trust with people, and then kind of lead them there. And it doesn't happen overnight. Um, but I do think one of the things, and I've been allergic to this for a really long time, of, well, we're going to do it this way because we've always done it this way.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's, and yet I used to, there's a, CIOs will often say we want to be able to reuse our existing skills and we need things to be more cost effective and more productive in this and this. I was like, so let's go back to that existing skills thing.
Yeah.
So what you're telling me is you want to keep doing things exactly the way you've been doing them, and yet you want things to be better, faster, cheaper. How do you expect that to work out?
Yeah.
All right. Virtual machines versus physical machines. Did we really change the techniques of what we are doing, or did we just shove an expensive management layer in the middle and we keep doing everything the same?
Sure.
So, and really the answer to your question is I pull all of this kind of anecdotal stuff into trying to show a customer how there is a better way and there's a reason to go with the better way,
Yeah.
going all the way back to the beginning where I was talking about the silos where developers and architects are constrained. Okay. And I think one of the things we as vendors need to do, both your company and mine, is help customer groups loosen up those constraints. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was probably way more than you thought you were plugging into, but
No,
yeah,
no. And
that's
I mean, I think any opportunity to hear your thoughts on this, because I think that, from my perspective, I have a luxury is I am no longer in my day job. I don't talk with, I guess you could say, use the canonical enterprise customer. I don't talk to them very, very
Right.
often. And when I do, I'm talking to usually an audience that wants to talk to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have a different luxury. You have an opportunity to talk to customers that probably don't want to talk to you. And the reason
Or
why
they
they don't want
certainly
to,
don't want to hear what I have to say.
that's a better way to phrase it, right? Because I don't talk to a ton of customers that have a bunch of like, oh, we don't need it. We don't have any interest in this. Like, because in my particular vein of the world, developer advocacy, like people are excited to talk to someone like me because they want to hear the latest and
Right.
greatest. They want to get some anecdotes about how to use this new technology to solve business problems. On your side, you have accounts. Some of them are, I guess, more forward thinking. Some of them are more, hey, let's just keep the
Mm-hmm.
lights on and make money. But I think one thing that was interesting that you said is it's very much there are restraints that are always going to be there, but it's a matter of having them not be as tight, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the real thing that really, really matters. Like a company can decide not to use open source technology for a ton of reasons. Maybe the licensing isn't advantageous to them. Maybe there's just fear of security vulnerabilities because it's not code they wrote. There
Right.
is something to say about the code that is probably in GitHub in the, highest used NuGet package on the planet is probably more secure than something you wrote, right? That's a whole conversation in and of itself.
Sure.
Um, but I think especially what's interesting to me is that there's almost this mindset that needs to shift about it's it's not just software that just exists. It's hundreds or potentially thousands of developers working together to build a product that can help you in your business. That just so
Right.
happens to be free, right? Or cost effective is a better way to phrase it, right? Cost effective. I knew you were going to say the word free is whatever, but I think it's very, very important to call that out, right? Because open source in a lot of spaces, like it's, oh, we don't want to do open source. Like I'm making an X for the people that are listening on the podcast. I'm making an X, like it's cursed or it's a hex, right? Because of we don't
But
know
the
who
other
these.
thing exists
Yeah,
too, right?
yeah, yes, yes, right.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah,
Both
like
are both are valuable. It's really best tool for the job, right?
yeah, yeah, of course. And if the tool happens to be available on the internet and can be downloaded and you can have a conversation with the developers, I know because I've worked in a space where I've had to work with software vendors before. Like sometimes software vendors are very helpful. Some of them are very, um, let's just say, not quite helpful unless you want to pay extra for premium support, right? And
What? Who would do that?
yeah, and it's not to knock any large company, but I like that is the thing. Like the level of support is completely dependent on how much money you're willing to pay for that support in most cases. When you're taking
Agreed.
advantage, when
Yes.
you're using tools like that are on GitHub or NuGet or npm or whatever, right?
Mhm.
There's a different transaction that takes place with support, and that is what I think what the big challenge is for a lot of companies. You mean I just can't call a number and talk to somebody to get help? I have to go to some tool and create some issue, and then
Right.
like I have to conversate
Oh.
over. Yeah, I have to conversate in a public way about the issue that my company is having with your tool. Like that's not
Hmm.
something we're interested in.
Well, and there's another layer to it as well. So I don't agree with the all open source or no open source. I just don't think that's a great idea.
Sure.
Um, but I have a customer, and I'm going to anonymize this pretty thoroughly. They chose an open source database.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you choose something like a database, it's going to typically involve a cluster of servers. Somebody's got to manage it. Somebody's got
Yep.
to patch the servers. You got to patch because I'm not seeing a lot at this point, the whole pets versus cattle that you
Mm-hmm.
guys, started, particularly with Netflix. I'm not seeing a lot of that taking place. So you got a cluster of servers that has to be administered. It has to be patched. The application tier has to be patched. These are on different cycles. Um, in a lot of cases, you can't do that without disrupting the system. If you've
Yep.
got a high availability system, you get into so when we say free, that's why I said air quotes free. Okay,
Yeah.
because I'll tell you, the ops team that has to do all that, it's not free to them,
No,
you know,
no. I
right?
mean, even the
So
even the
all of
even the dev team that's building it, like nothing is free in this world. Let's be honest. Everything takes at
correct.
least time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, I
actually, I
interrupted
just
you.
heard yesterday that the expertise in this particular technology, there were three of them who knew it. They've all left the company.
Sure, that's a problem too.
Right? Exactly. And this is why you hear me, I've kind of, I went from cloud, I went to microservices, and now I'm spending a lot of time on DevOps because this idea of dev and ops collaborating to avoid these problems. No problem with open source. Bring it in, let the ops guys have a look at it at the same time. Let's figure out whether
Mhm.
this is the only tool that can solve the job, the problem, or so that it's worth the cost to the ops team, and then figure out how you need to put it together so that it is manageable over time. So I don't even remember where you started that,
No
that
worries.
thread, but I took off on the open source thing. So yeah. But as a general topic, it's not all open source. So Microsoft is considered open source friendly now. We support open source, yeah, until you call that aforementioned Premier support service and ask a question about some obscure open source stack, and then you find out, oh, by support we mean you can run it in our data center, and we'll be okay with that. That's a very different kind of conversation than supporting open source as a writ large statement.
Sure. No, I think that's, there's a lot of conversation to be had in this space, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you because at the end of the day, a company's goal is to make money, right?
Yep.
And, we've talked about this ad nauseum a few times in this conversation about like what tools can you leverage to make the most money possible in an ethical way? Ethical
Right.
being optional in some cases, right? So I think the thing that's most important is like, does this particular individual, are they a tool that we can use to make money? Our group of individuals,
Right.
is this
Mm-hmm.
software, is this tool, is this application pattern, like you mentioned microservices, right? Like
Right.
everything is a tool that enables the making of money at some company, right? And
Right.
I think
Mm-hmm.
is if we think about it like that and think of it completely from a transactional standpoint and get rid of all of the baggage, which again is almost impossible when you're dealing with humans, things become substantially easier to see. Because I think one of the things that really is troubling when we talk about large companies using open source is that there is this expectation that you're back contributing to open source. And that's something that a lot of
Right.
large companies can't take on because of a lot of reasons,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there is some interesting conversations to have in the space of like, if you're going to use open source, can you contribute to open source yourself? If the answer is no, not really, it might be no. Like maybe open source isn't a valuable option because nobody wants to be in a position where they're using open source and then a handful of very popular people on the internet, hey, this company is using this open source technology, let's bash them because they're not back contributing. Or, hey, they're making money off
Mm-hmm.
of this open source technology. It's not an adequate or ethical thing to be doing.
Well, and there's another tricky thing because I was around when Microsoft first started dabbling in the open source world. And our legal department was heavily involved because the way those licenses are written, if you accidentally commingle proprietary code with open source code, the open source community has rights to that code. And,
Sure.
and it can be a huge, so again, that's another challenge that needs to be considered when you're doing it. And you have to be really, really disciplined about it if you're going to adopt open source. If you're just going to download the binaries and use it, um, that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
But then you're also at the whim of whoever's maintaining it. We saw with the Log4j bug, some really bad stuff can happen when you put yourself at the whim of downloading a library and using it
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked about a lot of opportunities or things that we can do better. And I've been really enjoying this conversation. But we're at the top of the
Same
hour
here.
and
Mhm.
it's time to bid adieu, as they say. And I want to thank you, Mark, for being on the show and chatting about kind of your career in tech and your musings about different topics. It's been really great. Do you have any parting words or things you'd like to end on?
No, I was going to get into at some point. We took off down a path where I could talk about how UBI is the way to find for everybody to be able to universal basic income, how everybody's going to be able to find what it is they love doing is if they don't have to worry about making money.
I mean, I am very much in support of that as long as it's not going to cause undue effects on other stresses of the
Right.
economy. And I think I'd love to have a
Well, it
conversation
actually,
with you
yeah,
about that. Um,
sure.
because I think that you and I probably have similar thoughts on it.
Hmm.
And I would love to kind of hear if you can convince me the things that you and I might disagree on in that space. If you can convince me that I'm wrong, which I'm always a fan of.
Yeah. So Google the Star Trek economy and start there. The
I
UBI is actually the wrong solution.
Okay,
So
all right,
it's UBI is trying to force it before we're ready, but the Star Trek or the post-scarcity economy is how we can actually get there. And that's why
sure.
I'm ultimately an optimistic person because I think we will get there. I don't think we're headed for a Blade Runner future. I think we're headed for a Star Trek future.
Well, that's good to hear because Blade Runner is a terrifying future. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, as we wrap up the show, I do like to ask my guests one last question, and that question is for you, my friend Mark. If you can think of, all the things we've talked about today, technology,
Mhm.
open source, the community around it, but you only had one word to describe that feeling that you had, what would that word be for you?
Realism.
Realism. I mean,
Yes. We
you're
need to be
you're
realistic.
yeah, you're a realist, so that makes sense to me. Um,
Yes.
yeah, and this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. For folks tuning in, be sure to like and subscribe to the conversation that you're hearing. If you want to hear more, please reach out to me, and I'd like to hear like some of the conversations that you're having. So please, I'd love to chat with some more of you if you want. But this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Mark, so much
Yep.
for
I
being on
enjoyed
the
it.
show, and for
My
everybody
pleasure.
listening, take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.